Hey guys, thank you for tuning in to ChannelBK. My name's Brian. Welcome to an album review. This one is for Kanye West's My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy. Kanye West, rapper and producer from Chicago. And I really don't think I need to say too much of that because I know everyone has their opinions and views of this gentleman. But also to sort of put in perspective, this is his 5th studio album. And I kind of want to get through the reasonings why I am so fond of this record and also sort of the legacy of this record because I know that's the two things that have been said to death and whatever. And then we can just get into the actual album as a whole. It was November 2010, obviously. And I remember this record coming out and being so enthralled with it. Like, you know, I was listening to rap music a little beforehand, but this album really changed my way of music in general. Like, this was around the time where I finally started kind of delving more into music legitimately. To be honest, this record was something that has still captivated me listening to it again before this review. And it says a lot about Kanye for where he was at this point. Like, I never was a huge fan of him, but I never really was completely like outside of knowing who he was or knowing some of his songs. So obviously we know the legacy of this record. We know what it went on to do in terms of artists being influenced by it, not just in rap, but mainstream music or even indie music in general. It was one that critics loved and fans loved, and it was something that was this huge deal and sort of how it actually impacted Kanye's career down the road as well. But let's kind of get into where this album stood at the time, because to be honest, I think it's still very interesting. Kanye is obviously known for being a very controversial figure, and it was a lot going into this. Obviously, we have the whole George Bush and Hurricane Katrina debacle. We have the whole Today Show thing. We have the Taylor Swift VMA incident. But this was sort of the album that leaned in and kind of was a scary situation for Kanye, creatively and personally, because obviously previous to this record we got 808s and Heartbreaks, which is an album I personally love, but I know a lot of people were still very on the fence with that, and knowing that he was going in a direction like that kind of scared a lot of his fans. Plus all these things personally happening to him sort of had a big impact on what he was going to do next. And so leading up into this record, Kanye sort of dipped away and he sort of disappeared from the limelight to really hone in on this album. And the promotion for this album was so intriguing because I still remember watching his VMA performance of Runaway. And I think that was the moment where I really wanted to get into Kanye's music because that performance still was incredible. And so that sort of was a jumping off point into what this record accomplished. You know, Kanye obviously has been somebody that's always been trying to change up his style and doing new things. You know, he started off in the soul music direction. Then he went to more modern sort of big production, like big arena style production. Then he went to obviously more auto-tune and more synth leads and more 808 drums, obviously on 808s and Heartbreak. This album was a more maximal sort of beat heavy, sample heavy, huge production of an album. And it's still to this day just incredible to listen to. Now, obviously with all those things that I talked about in terms of content that he had for this album, obviously another lingering thing that was apparent to this album was his relationship with Amber Rose. You know, obviously 808s and Heartbreak, 90 to 95% of that was about her. Obviously, you know, there was little things about his, you know, now deceased mother on there as well. But this album sort of has a lot of the tricklings of Amber Rose. But in reality, this was sort of Kanye's first delving into sort of himself in a bigger sense in the ideas of fame. You know, it's not like Kanye hasn't talked about stuff like that in previous records, nor him sort of talking about stuff like this in general, but 808s was sort of the beginning of that. But I think this was the album that really capitalized on him, obviously later down his road as well, because that's kind of been his thing later down the road. It became an album about celebrity, about sort of his place, because that's what's so intriguing to me about this record. It's almost like watching like a Paul Thomas Anderson movie in a way. Like, I love Paul Thomas Anderson, and his movies are very much focused on somebody that is a very polarizing figure, and you have your sort of thoughts on it, but you still kind of are captivated watching every moment and just listening and sort of seeing what's going on. And I kind of compare this record to that because his ego becomes so apparent on here, but at the same time sort of his shyness and sort of his self-doubt and all that and sort of his self-esteem is very apparent as well. It's super low, And that makes for such a great juxtaposition on certain tracks on here and just the album creatively as a whole. But so, like I said, this album is very maximal. There's a lot of just things going on here. And I think Kanye really proved himself, obviously, with like Mike Dean and Jack Basker and a lot of other people. But he really proved what he wanted to do on here. And obviously, there's tricklings of all his styles and albums on here. But I think this is sort of where he redefined himself again, because up until this point, people sort of think he lost his way with 808s, but I think this is when he became a new version of Kanye, and it's still just a great listen. Obviously, the album opens up with Dark Fantasy, which I think is great. I think the chorus is so big and grandiose. I think Kanye's verses on here are also so great. I think the way he just sort of brings it in. Too many Urkels on your team, that's why your win's low, rather. Still is a great line. And that's another thing too about this album is I think Kanye has always been a very underrated rapper and all that sort of stuff. And I think this album really proved that he is underrated. Like, I think he showed up, and all of the features on here obviously as well showed up looking back on it. And it again just proves sort of his strengths as a rapper, as a writer, and as a producer. Something like Gorgeous, which still to this day, like his whole like second, like his last couple lines and like his last verse before Raekwon comes on, still great. You know, obviously he talks about stuff like South Park on this record and, you know, this whole idea of fame and all that sort of stuff. And I thought the guitars were really good. Kid Cudi's sort of part was really good. And this song, weirdly enough, has grown on me over the years, because I think when I first liked it, the auto-tune and sort of the tone of the song was always just the one thing holding me back, but I've grown to really like it. There's actually a lot of songs on here that don't really go in that huge direction. Something like Monster, which is obviously a lot more low-key. It's not necessarily not maximal, but it's a lot more minimal than pretty much any of the tracks on here. I thought the tribal drums are great. I thought all the features are good. And yes, we all know you can rap fucking Nicki Minaj's verse on Monster.
Who the fuck cares?
It's still a highlight on this album, but yet again, Jay-Z shows up. Rick Ross's intro, still pretty cool. Kanye West sounds great on it. And then also, this is the album that Kanye sort of latched on to Bon Iver, which I think he has some great contributions in terms of sampling as well as just vocally on this album as well. Something like Lost in the World, which is, I think, a phenomenal exit, which obviously Kanye sort of worked from a Bon Iver song and did sort of his own thing with it. And it's still a great way to finish the album. But then again, like I said, there's still a lot of moments on here that just are so apparent to kind of the situation he was in. Obviously, Runaway, which I love so much. I love the pianos on this track with Pusha T delivering a great verse. This track, in a way, is sort of the double-edged sword. It's the, I'm sorry for being this way, I'm sorry for being this, mentioning certain things of certain things he's done, but then it also works as kind of like a semi-love song in a way, like, and that's, I think, what's so brilliant about it is the apparentness of what you're hearing, but then it brings in all these other things that were going on in his life. And obviously this song in particular sort of made it seem like it was a Taylor Swift thing, even though he's gone on to say it's not an apology, but it becomes clear that this song is definitely like trying to be just a general song, but it obviously has a lot of underlying themes to it. And then something like The Blame Game with John Legend featuring some great vocals on here. Sort of the ups and downs and very explicit details of what I'm assuming is about Amber Rose. This is sort of one of those moments where I think, you know, when I first listened to the record, his whole idea of fame, because I think there's definitely some moments on here where you have to be a certain way in terms of being interested in Kanye or liking him or whatever, which I completely understand. Like, I really understand. I don't think it's as heavily apparent listening to the record. I don't think you need to necessarily be like so enamored. I think you don't really need to like him at all, but still find a lot on this record. But I think Blame Game is one of the few times that he really does a good job sort of honing in the listener, no matter what your view is on him, and giving such a great perspective into this relationship. And I think it's sort of like a nice sequel, sort of, not finale, but sort of like a cap end to what 808s and Heartbreak is. And yes, the Chris Rock outro is still legendary to this day. We all have said the line, Yeezy taught me, a billion times. And then we get something like Devil in a New Dress, which again, it's one of the many times where the sampling on this album is just so brilliant and great. I think, again, it sort of seems like an idea about Amber Rose or a relationship where Kanye sort of giving all this sort of religious imagery, something like Hell of a Life also does some stuff like that too. But on this song in particular, sort of, he being enamored with this woman and the whole line, you should be a sin, you're my sensation. Like, I think there's so many clever things he's doing on here. And then obviously Rick Ross comes through at the very end with a great verse after a really sick guitar solo right before it. We have songs like All of the Lights, which, I know was a really big single when this album came out, and I think this is another great example of the maximalism and sort of talking about how perfected this album is. It's so meticulous. We hear the stories now of how this took him like 2 years to record because there's a god-awful amount of people on this fucking song in terms of vocalists, but you can use that as sort of a big apparent theme through the whole album, which is so meticulous and so pinpoint specific. And again, it sort of layers over this whole album because I think a lot of the times Kanye uses this album not as just a way to focus on specific things, because I think that's been a lot more of his later work. We see a lot more later work of his where he's sort of honing in more on specific things that there needs no context. Whereas I think this album, he does a better job sort of using that in these songs. Like, I feel like there's lines here and there on songs that obviously bring up apparentness. Like, All of the Lights is a good example where it's him sort of bringing up his past and his present and sort of all these things he's had to deal with, drugs and abuse. And so you kind of hear stuff like that throughout the album. But at the same time, he makes a really good case on each song to make it more of a well put together song. And then all that stuff hits you after and sort of masks it. Obviously, something like Blame Game is very open and apparent. And there's other stuff. But I think this was the part that he was able to really still put it into an album that is still generalized through and through on specific topics, rather than just being very point blank what it is. Every time I hear the song Power, I'm still speechless after hearing this song all the time. I remember hearing this song for the first time when it first came out, and I still think, to this day, it's one of the best rap songs of, recent memory. It's so well crafted. I think the sampling and the specific things he uses to sample, the 21st Century Schizoid Man, it's just so... it's so brilliant, and Kanye just doesn't hold up on this track. This is where his brashness just comes through. All this stuff about this glamour and this life he's living in, the whole SNL stuff, and it's just, and the whole abomination of Obama's nation, and this is one of those moments where he just lets loose, but you're still just captivated because I think everything surrounding this song is great, including his flow. And that's, again, going back to him being so underrated as a rapper, and I think this album really certified him again, because, again, so many people with 808s sort of were on edge. But on this album in particular, there are some tracks on here where he just goes off. I think Gorgeous is a great example. Monster, Power, Dark Fantasy. But then there's also really poetic moments, or moments that are more subtle in his storytelling techniques, like Blame Game and Lost in the World, and even All of the Lights in a way. That one's a little bit more reserved because I think Rihanna kind of takes a little bit more, and then, Kid Cudi takes a bit on that track as well. But overall, I know this is an album that is so apparent talking about, and I know I won't really go into, things that maybe a lot of other people haven't seen or talked about, because, at almost 7 years old, I still find little things I like about it, and it's still an album that is so captivating on so many levels, because this is such a great example of an album that you get instantly hit with it the second you hear it, and just the more times you listen to it, you really start to dig into what Kanye's doing. Once again, to sort of end this review, I know Kanye's place, and I know the views that he's gotten from people, and sort of what has come out of this album. For me personally, I think this album cemented Kanye as sort of somebody who has these huge visions. And we see somebody like a Kendrick, or even like an Eminem, who there's really not that many people, I don't think, at least in rap music, that are sort of on these levels with these visions, like any artist in any other genre, and can really just put together something that's this sonically just, not just entertaining, but masterful, bringing on the best people to sort of really get him in a good place and to just solidly put out a great piece of work. Again, I think he cemented himself as one of the best rappers on this album too, because of just, I think everything leading up to this moment, and I think everyone being on the fence about him, he really just sort of came back and just smacked the shit out of everybody, which led to an album that I still listen to this day, and I think it's, in my opinion, one of the more important hip-hop albums of recent memory, and one of the more important sort of mainstream releases, because I think this album has done so much more than people give it credit for. But at the end of the day, I could talk about this album forever, and you know, I can listen to it forever, and there's not much more I could say, but I wanted to sit here to let you guys know, yes, I love this album a lot. So if you're one of the few people that hasn't heard this album, please go listen to it. And if you have heard it, what are sort of your views years down the road? Obviously, I know we probably have a lot to talk about on that, but if you liked, please like, please subscribe for more videos. But other than that, thank you guys so much for watching, and thank you for tuning in to Channel BK. Peace out, guys.